David Mitchell's hands trembled as he turned the rusted key in the lock of his childhood home. 15 years of silence stretched between him and the weathered door that had witnessed his angry departure at 18. Behind him, Ranger, his 11-year-old German shepherd, whined softly, amber eyes fixed on the house with an intensity that made David's chest tighten. The coastal Maine wind carried salt and memories as David stepped inside. Dust motes danced in shafts of August sunlight, illuminating a living room frozen in time. His father's worn leather chair sat empty, still indented with the shape of Robert Mitchell's body. 3 months dead, and the house still smelled like him, sawdust and coffee. But Ranger wouldn't settle. The dog paced restlessly, ignoring David's commands, his claws clicking against hardwood floors. Something pulled the animal toward the basement door with magnetic force. When David finally followed, Ranger began scratching desperately at the cellar wall, his whines becoming urgent, almost human. The hollow sound that echoed back when David knocked changed everything. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. David Mitchell had come home to bury ghosts, not resurrect them. At 42, he carried himself with the rigid posture of a career soldier, shoulders squared, jaw set, every movement economical and precise. 15 years in the Army had taught him to compartmentalize pain, to build walls around memories that threatened to bleed through. But standing in his father's house, those carefully constructed barriers felt paper-thin. The house on Frenchman Bay had been built in 1952, a modest two-story structure that clung to the rocky Maine coast like a barnacle. Robert Mitchell had raised his son here alone after David's mother, Martha, died of cancer when David was 10. The years that followed had been marked by a silence so profound it felt like a living thing. Occupying chairs at the dinner table, echoing through hallways, settling between father and son like an unbridgeable chasm. David's departure 15 years ago hadn't been dramatic, no slamming doors or shouted ultimatums. Just a quiet conversation at 18, his father standing by the kitchen window, coffee growing cold in his hands. "I'm enlisting," David had said. Robert had nodded once, turned back to watch the lobster boats bobbing in the harbor, and replied, "Be safe, son." That was it. No arguments, no pleas to stay. Just acceptance wrapped in that familiar, suffocating silence. The military had been David's salvation. Clear orders, defined missions, brotherhood forged in shared purpose. He'd risen through the ranks steadily, earning commendations and the respect of his peers. When he'd been assigned Ranger as his military working dog 7 years ago, David thought he'd finally found the one relationship that made sense: loyalty without complication, service without judgment. Ranger had been 3 then, all muscle and intelligence, bred for detection work in hostile territories. Together they'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, where the German shepherd's keen nose had saved countless lives by locating improvised explosive devices. The dog had been David's constant companion through firefights and long desert patrols, a steady presence when human connections felt too complicated to navigate. Now, at 11, Ranger showed his age in the gray threading through his sable coat and the careful way he moved his joints in the morning. But his amber eyes remained sharp, alert, missing nothing. David had adopted him officially when they both retired from active duty, unable to imagine life without his 4-legged battle buddy. The house felt smaller than David remembered, shrunken by years and neglect. Dust sheets covered most of the furniture like shrouds. Family photographs still lined the mantelpiece, his parents' wedding portrait, David in his high school graduation cap, his mother holding infant David in the hospital. Robert Mitchell appeared in every frame as a solid, unsmiling presence, his weathered hands and serious expression telling the story of a man shaped by hard work and harder losses. The morning of August 16th arrived with the kind of aggressive brightness that made David's head throb. He'd spent a restless night in his old bedroom surrounded by faded baseball posters and the ghost of his teenage self. Ranger had refused to sleep on the provided dog bed, instead positioning himself by the bedroom door like a sentry, ears pricked at every creak and groan of the settling house. David's plan was simple. 3 days to sort through his father's belongings, contact a lawyer, and put the property on the market. Clean, efficient, final. He'd already identified the most logical buyer, a development company that had been circling the coastal properties like vultures, offering cash deals to families struggling with inherited tax burdens. The knock on the front door came at precisely 9 o'clock, sharp and insistent. David opened it to find a man in his mid-40s wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place against the weathered coastal backdrop. Malcolm Torres had the kind of smile that never reached his eyes and a handshake that lingered a beat too long. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm so sorry for your loss," Malcolm began, his voice carrying the practiced sympathy of a funeral director. "Your father was a pillar of this community, a real old-school Maine fisherman, the kind they don't make anymore." David stepped back, not inviting him in. "If you're here about buying the house, I haven't made any decisions yet." Malcolm's smile widened. Of course. These things take time. But I want you to know that Torres Development is prepared to make you a very generous offer. Cash, no contingencies, quick closing. We understand that maintaining a property like this can be overwhelming, especially for someone dealing with, well, readjustment issues. The words hit David like a slap. Readjustment issues? I did my research, Mr. Mitchell. 15 years of military service, multiple deployments. It's admirable, really, your dedication to our country, but properties like this require constant attention, repairs, maintenance, dealing with the local bureaucracy, the tax burden alone. Malcolm gestured vaguely at the peeling paint on the porch railings. It's a lot for anyone to handle, especially someone who might be dealing with the invisible wounds of service. David's hands clenched into fists. The man was using his PTSD diagnosis against him, weaponizing his service record to create urgency. "I can handle my own affairs, Mr. Torres." Absolutely. But why burden yourself? This property is sitting on prime waterfront real estate. We're talking about transforming this entire stretch of coast into something magnificent. Luxury condominiums, a resort spa, maybe a marina. Your father's legacy could become part of something much bigger, something that brings prosperity to the whole community. Behind David, Ranger began to pace. The dog's behavior had been increasingly agitated since their arrival, but now his restlessness took on an almost frantic quality. He moved between the living room and the basement door, whining softly, his claws clicking against the hardwood floors in an irregular rhythm that set David's teeth on edge. "I'll need time to think about it," David said, eager to end the conversation. Malcolm reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. "I've taken the liberty of having our attorneys prepare a preliminary offer. It's quite generous, I think you'll find. But the local zoning board meets next week, and after that, well, the regulatory landscape might change. Windows of opportunity like this don't stay open forever." After Malcolm left, David found himself standing in the kitchen, staring at the envelope he'd been too proud to refuse. The number was substantial, enough to buy a comfortable house anywhere in the country, enough to disappear completely from Bar Harbor and everything it represented. But Ranger's agitation was becoming impossible to ignore. The German Shepherd had positioned himself at the basement door, his massive frame trembling with suppressed energy. When David approached, Ranger began scratching at the door itself, his claws leaving marks in the old wood. The dog's amber eyes held an intensity David recognized from their military days, the focused alertness that preceded a significant discovery. "What is it, boy?" David asked, kneeling beside his companion. What's got you so worked up?" Ranger responded by increasing his scratching, adding sharp, demanding barks that echoed through the quiet house. David had seen this behavior before, in Afghanistan, when Ranger had detected something important, usually explosives or hidden weapons caches. The dog never acted like this without reason. David opened the basement door, and Ranger immediately bounded down the steep wooden stairs, his arthritis forgotten in his urgency. David followed more cautiously, using his phone's flashlight to navigate the dim space. The basement was exactly as he remembered, a cramped, musty storage area filled with his father's old fishing equipment and boxes of forgotten household items. But Ranger ignored everything else, making a direct line to the far wall. He began scratching at a section of wooden paneling with desperate intensity, whining and barking as if trying to communicate something crucial. David approached the wall, running his hands over the weathered boards. When he knocked, the sound that echoed back was unmistakably hollow. David stared at the wall, his mind struggling to process what his ears had confirmed. The hollow sound meant empty space, a void where solid foundation should have been. He knocked again, moving his fist methodically across the wooden panels. Solid, solid, hollow, hollow, solid. A section roughly 4 feet wide returned that unmistakable echo of nothingness. Ranger sat back on his haunches, panting heavily from his exertion, but his amber eyes remained fixed on the wall with laser intensity. The dog's behavior reminded David of their missions in Kandahar, when Ranger would locate hidden weapons caches with this same unwavering focus. But this wasn't Afghanistan, and whatever lay behind this wall had been hidden by his own father. David retrieved a crowbar from his father's tool collection, its weight familiar and reassuring in his hands. Military training had taught him to approach unknowns with systematic caution. He wedged the flat end into a barely visible seam between 2 panels, applying steady pressure. The wood groaned in protest, aged nails shrieking as they pulled free from their moorings. The first panel came away with a sharp crack, revealing darkness beyond. David's phone flashlight cut through the void, illuminating rough wooden steps descending into what appeared to be a hidden room. The air that escaped carried scents he hadn't expected: sawdust, linseed oil, and the warm smell of well-maintained wood. This wasn't some forgotten storage space. This was something purposeful, something cared for. "Stay, Ranger," David commanded softly. But the German shepherd was already moving past him, descending the hidden stairs with careful but determined steps. David had no choice but to follow. The stairs opened into a room that defied everything David thought he knew about his father. His flashlight beam swept across what could only be described as a master craftsman's workshop. The space was larger than the basement above, extending under what must have been the house's front porch. Every surface spoke of meticulous organization and passionate dedication. Along one wall, hand tools hung in perfect arrangement: chisels, planes, gauges, and saws, each suspended from custom hooks with painted outlines showing their proper placement. A workbench dominated the center of the room, its thick maple surface scarred by years of use but clean and ready for work. Lumber was stacked with military precision against the far wall: walnut, cherry, maple, and oak, seasoned and waiting. But it was the finished pieces that stopped David's breath entirely. Displayed on custom shelving were works of art that belonged in museums. A child's rocking horse with a flowing mane carved with incredible delicacy. A jewelry box with intricate dovetailed joints that spoke of master-level craftsmanship. A set of wooden bowls so perfectly formed they seemed to glow in the flashlight beam. David's hands shook as he examined each piece. This wasn't the work of a weekend hobbyist. This was the legacy of an artist, someone who understood wood like others understood language. Every cut was intentional, every joint was perfect. Every surface was finished to silk smoothness. His father, his silent, emotionally distant father, had been a master craftsman. On the workbench lay blueprints, detailed drawings that showed the same meticulous attention to precision David recognized from military engineering. But these weren't tactical plans. They were designs for furniture, toys, and household items, all drawn with the loving detail of someone who saw beauty in function. David's name appeared in the corner of several sheets, written in his father's careful script, for David's future home. Ranger had positioned himself beside a cloth-covered object in the corner, whining softly. When David pulled away the canvas tarp, he found himself staring at an unfinished baby crib. The walnut wood glowed like amber in the flashlight beam, its partially carved headboard showing the delicate outline of sailing ships and anchors. One corner post remained rough and unfinished, as if the craftsman had been forced to stop mid-project. A leather journal lay open on a small side table, its pages filled with his father's distinctive handwriting. David's flashlight illuminated the open entry, dated just 3 months before his father's death. David called today. First time in 2 years. He sounded tired, older. I wanted to tell him about the crib, about the workshop, about how proud I am of the man he's become. But the words wouldn't come. They never do. Martha, I'm running out of time to say what needs saying. My hands shake too much to do the detail work now. Maybe that's fitting. I never could do the detail work with my son either. David's vision blurred as the implications crashed over him like a physical wave. His father hadn't been cold or indifferent. He'd been inarticulate, trapped by an inability to express feelings through words, but here, in wood and steel and careful craftsmanship, Robert Mitchell had been speaking all along. Every piece in this workshop was a love letter. Every perfect joint was an expression of caring that David had never learned to read. The unfinished crib represented dreams David had never known his father harbored, hopes for grandchildren, for a future where the silence between father and son might finally be broken by the laughter of a new generation. The partially carved ships spoke of voyages never taken, stories never shared, connections never made. Ranger moved closer to David, pressing his solid warmth against his master's leg. The dog seemed to sense the emotional earthquake happening above him, offering the simple comfort of presence. David knelt beside his companion, burying his face in the thick fur of Ranger's neck, breathing in the familiar scent of his only true friend. "He loved us, didn't he, boy?" David whispered into the dog's coat. "He just didn't know how to show it." But even as understanding began to dawn, questions multiplied. Why hide this? Why construct an elaborate secret workshop instead of simply sharing his passion? What had driven Robert Mitchell to express his deepest self in solitude, away from the son who might have shared his love for creating beauty from raw materials? The journal beckoned from its resting place, promising answers, but threatening to reveal truths David might not be prepared to handle. His father was 3 months dead, but here, in this hidden sanctuary, Robert Mitchell's voice was clearer than it had ever been in life. The silence that had driven David away wasn't absence. It was the sound of a man drowning in everything he couldn't say. Above them, the house creaked and settled in the afternoon wind, but down here in the hidden workshop, time seemed suspended. David found himself at a crossroads he hadn't anticipated. Malcolm Torres was waiting upstairs with his cash offer and his implied threats about David's capability to maintain the property. But this discovery changed everything. This wasn't just a house anymore. It was a shrine to unrequited love, a testament to the creative spirit of a man David was only now beginning to understand. Ranger settled beside the unfinished crib, his breathing steady and calm for the first time since their arrival. The dog seemed to know that his mission was accomplished. He had led David to the truth, and now it was up to his master to decide what to do with it. David spent the next 2 days in the hidden workshop, reading his father's journal with the desperate intensity of an archaeologist deciphering ancient texts. Each entry revealed another layer of the man he'd never truly known, a man who wrote daily letters to his deceased wife, who worried obsessively about his son's safety overseas, who poured his unexpressed emotions into wood grain and careful joinery. The journal entries weren't chronological. Robert had written whenever the mood struck him, creating a scattered timeline of longing and regret that spanned David's entire adult life. Some entries were technical, notes about wood selection, finishing techniques, tool maintenance. But interspersed between these practical observations were raw confessions of a father's heart. March 15, 2018, David's unit was in a firefight near Kabul. Saw it on the news. Couldn't sleep for 3 days until Tom Bradley showed me the email saying he was safe. I wanted to call him, but what would I say? I love you, son. The words feel too small, too late. Instead, I started the rocking horse. If he ever comes home with children, they'll have something made by their grandfather's hands. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all I can give. David's throat tightened as he read. During that firefight, he'd been thinking about home too. Not the house, but the silence that had driven him away. He'd never imagined his father was awake nights, worrying, creating toys for grandchildren who existed only in hope and imagination. Ranger had claimed the workshop as his domain, moving between the unfinished crib and David's side with protective vigilance. The German shepherd's arthritis seemed less pronounced down here, as if the discovery of purpose had temporarily restored his youthful energy. But David could see the subtle signs of his companion's aging, the careful way he navigated the stairs, the longer rest periods between bursts of activity, the cloudiness beginning to develop in his amber eyes. On the morning of August 18th, Malcolm Torres returned with reinforcements. David heard the car doors slam from his position in the workshop and climbed the hidden stairs to find 3 people standing in his living room. Malcolm, a woman in a business suit carrying a briefcase, and a man David didn't recognize wearing a sheriff's department uniform. "Mr. Mitchell," Malcolm began with false cheerfulness, "I'd like you to meet Rebecca Santos, our legal counsel, and Deputy Harrison. We're here to discuss some concerns about the property." David's military training kicked in. This was an ambush, carefully orchestrated to create pressure and urgency. "Concerns?" Rebecca Santos opened her briefcase with professional efficiency. "The property has been flagged for several building code violations that came to light during the preliminary survey. The electrical system is outdated, there are structural issues with the foundation, and the septic system doesn't meet current environmental standards. The cost of bringing everything up to code would be substantial." She slid a typed report across the coffee table. The estimated repair costs were staggering, nearly $50,000. David scanned the document, looking for the trap he knew was there. "Of course," Malcolm interjected smoothly, "Torres Development would be happy to purchase the property as is, taking full responsibility for all necessary improvements. It would save you the hassle and expense of dealing with these issues yourself." Deputy Harrison stepped forward. "There's also the matter of property taxes. They're 3 months in arrears. The county will begin foreclosure proceedings if the balance isn't settled within 30 days. David felt the walls closing in. His father's modest savings had been depleted by medical expenses in his final months. David's own resources were limited. He'd spent most of his military savings on Ranger's medical care and his own PTSD treatment. The hidden workshop, for all its emotional significance, didn't change the mathematical reality of his financial situation. "I need time to consider my options," David said. Malcolm's smile turned predatory. "Time is exactly what you don't have, Mr. Mitchell. The tax deadline is firm, and these building code violations require immediate attention. Deputy Harrison is here as a courtesy, but the county has the authority to condemn the property if safety issues aren't addressed promptly." After they left, David sat in his father's chair, staring at the papers scattered across the coffee table. The numbers didn't lie. Even if he could somehow raise the money for repairs, the ongoing costs of maintaining a coastal property were beyond his means. Malcolm Torres might be a vulture, but he was offering a practical solution to an impossible problem. Ranger emerged from the basement, moving slowly up the stairs. The confrontation seemed to have exhausted him, and David noticed the dog was breathing harder than usual. When David knelt to examine him more closely, he found Ranger's gums were pale, his heartbeat irregular. The drive to the veterinary clinic in Ellsworth took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Dr. Sarah Chen, a woman in her 50s with gentle hands and honest eyes, examined Ranger with thorough professionalism while David paced the small examination room. "He's showing signs of congestive heart failure," she said finally. "It's not uncommon in German shepherds his age, especially military working dogs who've been exposed to stress and environmental toxins. The condition is manageable with medication, but what? His quality of life will decline gradually. He'll have less energy, more difficulty breathing, episodes like the one you described today. With proper care, he could have months, maybe a year, without it." She didn't finish the sentence. The medication would cost $800 per month. David's veteran's disability payments barely covered his own expenses. He stared at Ranger, who was looking back at him with those intelligent amber eyes, and felt something break inside his chest. That evening, David returned to the workshop and continued reading his father's journal. The entries from David's childhood painted a picture of a man desperate to connect with his son, but paralyzed by his own emotional limitations. June 12, 2001. David turns 16 tomorrow. I wanted to take him fishing, just the two of us, like my father took me. But every time I try to talk to him, the words get stuck. He looks at me waiting for something, and I freeze up. Martha would know what to say. She always did. The boy thinks I don't care. I can see it in his eyes. How do I tell him that I care so much? It terrifies me. The entry was dated one day before the car accident that had changed everything between them. David remembered that fishing trip. It had never happened. Instead, he'd stolen his father's truck and crashed it into a neighbor's mailbox, setting in motion the chain of events that had driven him from home. The next entry was dated weeks later. July 3, 2001, sold the Sea Star today. 47 years old, and I just sold the only thing that ever made sense to me besides Martha and the boy. Tom Bradley nearly cried when I signed the papers. The insurance won't cover all the damage from David's accident, and the Hendersons are threatening to sue. I won't let that burden fall on my son. He's angry and confused and looking for any excuse to leave. Better he should think I don't understand him than know the price of his mistakes. David's hands trembled as he read. The Sea Star had been his father's livelihood, his passion, his connection to the sea that had shaped 3 generations of Mitchell men. Robert had sacrificed everything to protect his son from the consequences of teenage recklessness, and David had never known. The final entries in the journal were the most heartbreaking. February 8, 2024. My hands shake too much to do detail work now. Dr. Peterson says it's the arthritis, but I know better. I'm running out of time. The crib will never be finished. David will never know about this place, about what I tried to build for him. Maybe that's for the best. He has his own life now, his own path. I just pray someone someday will tell him that his old man loved him. That everything I couldn't say was here, in these walls, in these pieces I made for the family I hoped we'd have. David closed the journal and sat in the silence of the workshop, surrounded by the physical manifestations of his father's love. Above him, he could hear Ranger moving restlessly, the dog's nails clicking against the hardwood floors in an irregular rhythm that matched David's own rapid heartbeat. The choice before him was stark. He could sell the house to Malcolm Torres, use the money to pay for Ranger's medical care, and walk away from Bar Harbor forever. Or he could find a way to keep the property, preserve his father's legacy, and watch his beloved companion slowly deteriorate from lack of proper treatment. Either path led to loss. The only question was what he was willing to sacrifice, the past or the future, memory or hope, his father's hidden love or his dog's remaining time. As if summoned by his thoughts, Ranger appeared at the top of the hidden stairs, whining softly. The German shepherd descended carefully, his movements stiff but determined. He positioned himself beside the unfinished crib and looked at David with those amber eyes that seemed to hold infinite understanding. David reached out to stroke the dog's graying muzzle, and Ranger leaned into the touch with a soft sigh. In that moment, David understood what his father had been trying to tell him through wood and silence. Love wasn't always about the words you could say. Sometimes it was about the sacrifices you were willing to make. But understanding the lesson didn't make the choice any easier. The confrontation came at dawn on August 21st when David least expected it. He'd spent another sleepless night in the workshop trying to reconcile the impossible mathematics of his situation. Ranger's medication costs, the property taxes, the building violations, every path forward seemed to lead through financial ruin or heartbreaking sacrifice. Malcolm Torres didn't bother knocking this time. David heard the front door open and heavy footsteps crossing the living room above. He climbed the hidden stairs to find Malcolm standing in the kitchen with two other men, one carrying a clipboard, the other a camera. "Mr. Mitchell," Malcolm said without preamble, "I'm sorry it's come to this, but you've had ample time to consider our offer. These gentlemen are here to conduct a formal property assessment for the county. I'm afraid your window of opportunity is closing." David felt his military training kick in, the cold clarity that came with recognizing a tactical situation. "You're trespassing." Malcolm's smile was razor thin. "Actually, we're not. The county has authorized this inspection based on the building code violations. You can cooperate, or we can return with Deputy Harrison and a warrant." Behind David, he heard the distinctive sound of Ranger's claws on the basement stairs. The German shepherd emerged slowly, his breathing labored but his amber eyes alert to the tension in the room. The dog positioned himself between David and the intruders, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "That animal looks aggressive," one of the assessors said, taking a step backward. "We may need to call animal control." Something snapped inside David's chest. For 15 years, he'd controlled his temper through military discipline and hard-won emotional regulation. But the threat to Ranger, his battle-tested companion who'd saved countless lives and asked nothing in return but loyalty, shattered that careful restraint. "Get out," David said, his voice carrying the command authority he'd learned leading men in combat zones. "Get out of my house right now." Malcolm held his ground. "David, may I call you David? You're not thinking clearly. This property is a burden you can't afford to carry. Your father understood that. He was planning to sell before he died. Ask Tom Bradley if you don't believe me." The lie hit David like a physical blow. He'd read every page of his father's journal, seen the careful plans for David's return, the unfinished crib made with hope for future grandchildren. Robert Mitchell had died believing his son would never come home, but he'd never stopped preparing for that possibility. "You didn't know my father," David said. "I knew him well enough. He came to my office 6 months before he died, asking about property values." He was worried about what would happen to this place after he was gone, worried about leaving you with a burden you couldn't handle. Malcolm gestured around the modest kitchen with theatrical contempt. Look at this place, David. It's falling apart. The foundation is crumbling, the plumbing is shot, the electrical system is a fire hazard. Your father knew you'd be better off without it. Ranger's growling intensified, and David could see the stress was taking a physical toll on the aging dog. His breathing was more labored, his stance less steady. The confrontation was literally making his companion sick. He wanted to spare you this, Malcolm continued, pressing his advantage, just like he spared you the truth about the Sea Star. David's blood turned to ice. What do you know about the Sea Star? I know he sold it to pay for your mistakes. I know he mortgaged this house to cover the difference. I know he spent the last 15 years of his life living on Social Security and fish processing wages because his son was too proud to come home and too stubborn to call. Malcolm's voice turned falsely sympathetic. He loved you enough to sacrifice everything. The least you can do is not let that sacrifice be meaningless. The words were designed to wound, and they found their target with surgical precision. David felt his carefully constructed understanding of his father's motives begin to crumble. Had Robert really visited Malcolm's office? Had he really been planning to sell? Tom Bradley's voice cut through David's spiraling thoughts like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. That's enough, Malcolm. The hardware store owner stood in the doorway, his weathered face flushed with anger. Behind him stood 3 other men David vaguely recognized from his childhood, neighbors who'd known his father, members of the small community Robert Mitchell had served as a fisherman and craftsman. Tom, Malcolm said smoothly, I was just explaining to David how his father, you were lying to him, just like you lied to me when you came sniffing around asking questions about Robert's finances. Tom stepped into the kitchen and the other men followed. Robert never came to your office, Malcolm. He never wanted to sell this house. He told me a dozen times that he was keeping it for David, hoping his boy would come home someday. One of the other men, gray-haired and lean, spoke up. Robert Mitchell was the finest craftsman on this coast. He built half the custom work in Bar Harbor. That workshop of his was legendary among folks who appreciated quality. David's head snapped up. You knew about the workshop? Course we knew, Tom said gently. Robert wasn't secretive about his woodworking, just private. There's a difference. He made that rocking chair in my living room, the one my granddaughter loves. Made it when she was born, wouldn't take a penny for it. The gray-haired man nodded. He made the altar rail at St. Andrew's Church, donated the whole project. Most beautiful piece of sacred woodwork I've ever seen. The man was an artist. David felt his worldview shifting again, realigning around new information. His father hadn't been hiding his craftsmanship from shame or secrecy. He'd been protecting something precious, sharing it selectively with people who understood its value. Malcolm's face was reddening with frustration. This is all very touching, but it doesn't change the financial reality. The property taxes alone are paid, Tom interrupted. Robert set up a trust account at Down East Credit Union years ago. There's enough money to cover taxes and basic maintenance for the next 5 years minimum. That's impossible. My research showed. Your research was wrong because Robert kept his financial business private, same as everything else. Tom pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. Robert made me co-trustee last year when his health started failing. He wanted to make sure David would have options when he came home. David stared at the document Tom handed him, a trust agreement establishing a fund for property maintenance and taxes, funded by years of careful saving and the proceeds from Robert's custom woodworking projects. The balance was substantial enough to remove the immediate financial pressure Malcolm had been applying. Malcolm's composure finally cracked. This is ridiculous. You're all living in the past, trying to preserve something that should be torn down and rebuilt. This entire stretch of coast could be transformed into something magnificent. Luxury accommodations, a world-class resort. jobs for the whole community. Jobs that would disappear the moment tourism declined, the gray-haired man replied. We've seen what happens to communities that sell their souls to developers. 5 years of prosperity, then nothing but empty buildings and regret. Tom stepped closer to Malcolm, and David could see decades of main hardiness in the older man's posture. I think it's time for you to leave, Malcolm. David's got some thinking to do, and he doesn't need you pressuring him while he does it. Malcolm looked around the room, calculating odds and finding them unfavorable. This isn't over, he said finally. The building code violations are real. The structural problems won't fix themselves. Sooner or later, reality will catch up with all this sentimentality. After Malcolm and his assessors left, the kitchen fell silent, except for Ranger's heavy breathing. The German shepherd had weathered the confrontation, but David could see the cost in his labored movements and the way he lowered himself carefully to the floor. Tom knelt beside the dog, running experienced hands over Ranger's frame. "He's a good one," Tom said quietly. "Reminds me of the working dogs we had on fishing boats when I was young. They'd give everything for their crew no matter what it cost them. Dr. Chen says he needs expensive medication. Heart failure." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "German shepherds are prone to it, especially the working lines. But they're also fighters. Don't count him out yet." The gray-haired man introduced himself as Frank Morrison, a retired carpenter who'd worked with Robert on several projects. "Your father talked about you constantly," he said. "Worried about you, missed you, but proud as hell of your service. He showed us every letter, every email, every newspaper clipping that mentioned your unit." David felt tears threatening and fought them back. "I never knew. He never said." "Robert wasn't much for saying," Frank replied, "but he was hell for doing. That workshop of his, he called it his love letters to the future. Said someday you'd understand what he was trying to tell you." Tom stood, brushing dust from his knees. "The question now is what you want to do with that understanding. Malcolm's not wrong about the challenges. Maintaining a coastal property takes work and money. But Robert believed you were up for both." David looked around the kitchen, seeing it with new eyes. Not a burden to be shed, but a foundation to be built upon. Not his father's failure to communicate, but his different language of love. The workshop below wasn't just a hidden room. It was a library of unexpressed affection, a university of craftsmanship where David could learn to speak his father's native tongue. Ranger struggled to his feet and walked slowly to David's side, pressing his warm bulk against his master's leg. The dog's breathing was still labored, but his amber eyes held the same determination David remembered from their military days. Whatever came next, they would face it together. "I need to think," David said finally. Tom nodded and headed for the door, the other men following. "Take your time," he said. "But remember, some decisions can't be undone. Choose wisely." The call came at 3 in the morning on August 22nd. David jerked awake to find Ranger convulsing on the bedroom floor, his powerful body racked with spasms that seemed to tear through him like electrical storms. Foam flecked the German shepherd's muzzle, and his amber eyes rolled back, showing only whites. David dropped to his knees beside his companion, his hands moving with practiced efficiency born from battlefield medical training. He cleared Ranger's airway, turned him onto his side to prevent choking, and spoke in the calm, steady voice he'd used to comfort wounded soldiers in Afghanistan. "Easy, boy, easy. I'm here. You're safe." The seizure lasted 47 seconds. David counted every one. When it finally subsided, Ranger lay still except for his rapid, shallow breathing. His eyes found David's face with an expression that seemed almost apologetic, as if he were sorry for causing alarm. David's hand shook as he called Dr. Chen's emergency line. The drive to the veterinary clinic took 12 minutes through empty pre-dawn streets with Ranger wrapped in blankets on the passenger seat, conscious but barely responsive. David kept one hand on the dog's chest, feeling the irregular flutter of his heartbeat like a bird trapped in a cage. Dr. Chen met them at the clinic, her graying hair hastily pulled back, her face grave with professional concern. She examined Ranger with gentle thoroughness, while David paced the small room like a caged animal, his own heart hammering against his ribs. The seizure was caused by decreased oxygen to the brain, she explained finally. His heart failure is progressing faster than I'd hoped. The medication can slow the process, but... She paused, choosing her words carefully. David, you need to prepare yourself. We're looking at weeks now, maybe a month or two with aggressive treatment. Without it. She didn't finish the sentence. David stared at Ranger, who was lying on the examination table with IV fluids running into his front leg. The dog's breathing was steadier now, but David could see the exhaustion in every line of his body. This wasn't just aging. This was a warrior's body, finally surrendering to battles fought too long and too hard. How much? David asked quietly. $1,200 a week for the intensive protocol. That includes medications, twice-weekly monitoring, and emergency interventions when needed. It's expensive, but it's his best chance for quality time. David did the mathematics automatically. $1,200 a week for 8 weeks. Nearly $10,000. Even with his father's trust fund covering the property expenses, David's own resources couldn't stretch that far. His disability payments, his modest savings, everything he had wouldn't be enough. I need to think about it, David said, hating himself for the words. Dr. Chen's expression softened with understanding. I know it's a difficult decision, but David, you should know, Ranger's been fighting this longer than you realize. His blood work from his last routine exam 6 months ago showed early signs. He's been hiding the symptoms, the way working dogs do. He didn't want you to worry. The revelation hit David like a physical blow. While he'd been focused on his own struggles with PTSD and civilian adjustment, Ranger had been quietly fighting a losing battle with his own body, protecting his master from yet another burden. The dog's recent agitation about the house, his desperate search for the hidden workshop. Had he somehow known his time was running short? Had he been trying to complete one final mission before his strength failed entirely? David spent the rest of the night in the veterinary clinic's waiting room, watching Ranger sleep under the influence of stabilizing medications. The German Shepherd looked smaller somehow, diminished by the tubes and monitors that tracked his vital signs. But even unconscious, he maintained the alert posture of a soldier on duty, ready to spring into action if his master needed him. As dawn broke over Bar Harbor, David found himself facing the cruelest decision of his life. He could sell the house to Malcolm Torres, use every penny to pay for Ranger's treatment, and hope for a miracle. Or he could accept that some battles couldn't be won with money or determination, that love sometimes meant knowing when to let go. The workshop called to him like a siren song. David left the clinic with promises to return by noon with his decision and drove home through the early morning mist. The house felt different now, not empty but expectant, as if it were holding its breath waiting for his choice. In the hidden workshop, surrounded by his father's tools and unfinished dreams, David opened the leather journal to a page he'd skipped before. The entry was dated just 2 weeks before his father's death. March 1st, 2024. Ranger is getting old. I can see it in the way he moves when David brings him to visit. 11 years for a German Shepherd is a lifetime of service. David doesn't see it yet. He's not ready to see it. But I know that look in a dog's eyes when he's starting to say goodbye. I remember it from Skip, the old lab we had when David was small. Skip died the winter Martha got sick. David cried for days. He was only 9, too young to understand that loving something means accepting that you can't keep it forever. I wonder if he's learned that lesson yet. I wonder if any of us ever do. David's throat constricted as he read his father's words. Robert had seen what David was only now recognizing, that Ranger's loyalty ran so deep he would hide his own suffering rather than cause his master pain. The dog who had saved David's life countless times in Afghanistan was still trying to protect him, even as his own body betrayed him. The unfinished crib sat in the corner like an accusation. David approached it slowly, running his hands over the partial carving of sailing ships on the headboard. His father's arthritis-stiffened fingers had struggled with the detail work, but the love in every line was unmistakable. This was meant to be a gift for grandchildren Robert would never meet, a legacy of craftsmanship passed down through generations. But what if David never had children? What if the crib remained forever unfinished, a monument to hopes that never materialized? Was preserving his father's workshop worth sacrificing Ranger's remaining time? David picked up one of his father's chisels, feeling the worn smoothness of the wooden handle. The tool felt right in his hands, as if it had been waiting for him. Without conscious decision, he found himself beginning to work on the unfinished carving, following the lines his father had sketched in pencil on the walnut surface. The rhythm of the work was meditative, hypnotic. Each careful cut revealed more of the sailing ship hidden in the wood grain, and with each revelation, David felt something shifting inside his chest. This wasn't just craftsmanship, it was conversation, a dialogue between past and present, conducted in the universal language of creation. Hours passed without David noticing. The morning sun climbed higher, streaming through the workshop's small window and illuminating his work. When his phone finally rang, he was startled to find it was nearly noon. Dr. Chen's voice was gentle but concerned. "David, you said you'd be here by now." "Ranger's awake and asking for you." David looked at his hands covered in walnut shavings, then at the crib where a beautiful sailing ship was emerging from the wood. In working on his father's unfinished project, he'd found his answer. "I'll be right there," David said. He climbed the hidden stairs and walked through the house one more time, seeing it not as a burden or a shrine to the past, but as a foundation for whatever came next. His father's trust fund would cover the property expenses. The workshop would remain, preserved not as a museum, but as a working space where hands could continue the conversation Robert had started. But first, he had a different kind of conversation to finish. One that would require all the courage he'd learned in 15 years of military service and all the love he'd discovered in his father's hidden sanctuary. The drive to the veterinary clinic felt like his longest journey home. Ranger was waiting when David arrived at the veterinary clinic, his amber eyes tracking every movement as his master entered the recovery room. The German shepherd's tail managed a weak wag, and he lifted his great head from the padded table with obvious effort. Dr. Chen stood beside the examination table, her expression carefully neutral, waiting for David's decision. "How is he?" David asked, though the answer was written in the labored rise and fall of Ranger's chest, in the way the dog's eyes seemed both alert and infinitely tired. "Stable for now. The medications are helping. But David, you need to understand. What happened this morning will happen again. Probably sooner rather than later." David approached the table and placed his hand on Ranger's head, feeling the familiar warmth of his companion's coat. The dog leaned into the touch with a soft whine of contentment, and David felt something break open inside his chest. "I've made my decision," David said quietly. "But first, I need to tell you something." Over the next hour, David found himself sharing the story of the hidden workshop, his father's journal, and the unfinished crib. Dr. Chen listened without interruption. her professional demeanor softening as David described the sailboat he'd begun carving that morning. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man," she said finally. "Animals teach us about unconditional love, but they also teach us about letting go with grace. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is recognize when fighting becomes suffering." David nodded, his throat too tight for words. He'd made the same calculation on countless battlefields: when to press forward, when to retreat, when to accept that some missions couldn't be completed no matter how much courage or determination you brought to bear. But before he could voice his decision, Tom Bradley appeared in the clinic doorway, slightly out of breath and carrying a manila envelope. "David, I'm glad I caught you. I found something at the house. Was dropping off some supplies for the workshop and thought you should see this right away." Tom handed him the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside, David found a letter in his father's handwriting dated just 1 week before Robert's death. The envelope was addressed simply, "For David, when Ranger's time comes." David's hands shook as he unfolded the single sheet of paper. "Son, if you're reading this, it means you've come home and discovered the workshop. It also means you're facing a decision I hoped I'd be there to help you make. I've watched you with that dog, seen the bond between you. It reminds me of the connection I had with Skip when you were small, and before him, the working dogs we kept on the boats when I was young. Ranger has given you everything a companion can give: loyalty, protection, love without condition or reservation. Now he's asking for something in return, though he's too noble to ask directly. He's asking you to love him enough to let him go with dignity when his body can no longer serve the spirit inside it. I know this decision will tear your heart out. I know because I've been there. Skip was suffering at the end, but I kept him alive because I couldn't bear to say goodbye. Your mother finally had to tell me that love isn't about holding on. It's about doing what's best for the one you love, even when it destroys you." In the workshop, you'll find a wooden box I made for Skip's ashes. It's on the high shelf behind the walnut boards. Inside the box is the collar he wore, and a letter I wrote to him that I never had the courage to read aloud. Maybe it will help you find the words you need. You have a gift I never developed, the ability to speak what you feel. Use that gift now, not just for Ranger's sake, but for your own. Tell him what he's meant to you. Thank him for his service. Let him know it's okay to rest. The hardest lesson I learned after your mother died was that grief is love with nowhere to go. But I was wrong about that. Grief is love that transforms, becomes memory, becomes gratitude, becomes the foundation for loving again. You'll know when it's time. Trust that knowing. With love and understanding, Dad. P.S. The vet bills are covered. I set aside money specifically for Ranger's final care. Don't let money make this decision for you. Let love make it." David read the letter twice, tears blurring his vision. Dr. Chen and Tom waited in respectful silence while he processed his father's final gift, not just financial security, but permission to make the loving choice, even when it felt like destruction. Ranger had been watching David read, and now the dog struggled to lift his head higher, his intelligent eyes seeming to understand that something significant was happening. David folded the letter carefully and leaned down until his face was level with his companion's. "You've been trying to tell me, haven't you, boy? You've been ready for a while now." Ranger's tail gave the faintest wag, and he pressed his nose against David's cheek, a gesture of forgiveness and gratitude that nearly broke David's composure entirely. "Dr. Chen," David said without taking his eyes off Ranger, "I want to take him home, to the workshop, when it's time. Can you come to us?" "Of course. It's actually better that way, less stressful for him, more peaceful for both of you." The drive home was different from any they'd taken together. David drove slowly, taking the scenic route along the coast, while Ranger sat in the passenger seat with his head out the window, breathing the salt air with obvious pleasure. They stopped at the harbor where Robert's boat had once been moored, and David carried Ranger down to the water's edge. "This is where it all started, boy. 3 generations of Mitchell men work these waters. Dad's gone now, but the workshop is still there. The tools are still there. Maybe someday I'll learn to use them the way he did." Ranger's breathing was growing more labored, but he seemed content to rest against David's side, watching the lobster boats return from their afternoon runs. The rhythm of the waves against the rocky shore was hypnotic, eternal, and David found himself thinking about the continuity of love, how it passed from generation to generation, species to species, changed form but never truly disappeared. That evening in the workshop, David found the wooden box his father had mentioned. It was simple but elegant, made from cherry wood with brass corners and a small brass nameplate engraved with "Skip, faithful friend." Inside, along with a worn leather collar, was Robert's letter to his childhood companion. "Dear Skip, I'm sorry I waited so long to say goodbye. I thought keeping you alive meant I loved you more, but Mom was right. Sometimes love means letting go. Thank you for teaching me what loyalty looks like. Thank you for showing David what it means to have a friend who never judges, never leaves, never stops believing in you. I hope wherever you are now, your legs don't hurt anymore and there are endless fields to run through. Save a spot for me, old friend." David read the letter aloud to Ranger, who was lying peacefully beside the unfinished crib. The German shepherd's breathing was shallow but steady, and his amber eyes remained fixed on David's face with perfect attention. He was right, wasn't he, Ranger? About love meaning letting go, about some missions ending not in victory, but in peace. David's voice cracked on the words, but he forced himself to continue. "You've been the best partner a soldier could ask for. In Afghanistan, you saved more lives than either of us could count. You brought me home from the war, and then you brought me home to this place, to understanding what Dad was trying to tell me all along." Ranger's tail moved slightly. Not quite a wag, but acknowledgement. "I need you to know that everything good about me, I learned from watching you. Loyalty without condition. Courage when it matters. Love that doesn't keep score or ask for explanations. You've been my teacher, my protector, my brother in arms." David spent the night in the workshop, working on the sailing ship carving while Ranger slept nearby. Every so often the dog would wake and watch David work, his amber eyes holding a satisfaction that seemed to say, "Good, you're learning his language now. You're home." Dr. Chen arrived at sunrise carrying her medical bag and moving with the gentle efficiency of someone who understood the sacred nature of goodbye. She examined Ranger briefly, then looked at David with compassionate eyes. "He's ready," she said simply. "His body is tired, but he's at peace. He knows he's completed his mission." David nodded, unable to speak. He positioned himself so that Ranger's head rested in his lap, one hand stroking the familiar curve of the dog's skull, the other holding the collar from the wooden box. A bridge between past and present, father and son, one faithful companion and another. "Thank you, Ranger," David whispered as Dr. Chen prepared the injection. "Thank you for bringing me home. Thank you for showing me what love looks like. Thank you for 15 years of friendship that asked for nothing but gave everything." Ranger's amber eyes found David's face one last time, and in that gaze was everything David needed to know. Mission accomplished, duty fulfilled, love understood and returned. The German shepherd's breathing grew softer, then stopped entirely, as peaceful as falling asleep in the sun. In the silence that followed, David understood what his father had meant about grief being love with nowhere to go, but he also understood the rest of the lesson. that love transformed becomes memory, becomes gratitude, becomes the foundation for loving again. Ranger's love hadn't disappeared. It had become part of the workshop, part of the house, part of the man David was still learning to become. The morning sun streamed through the workshop window, illuminating the unfinished crib and the sailing ship David had carved from his father's sketches. There was work to be done, a legacy to complete, a language of love to master. And for the first time since coming home, David felt ready for all of it. 3 weeks after Ranger's death, David woke to the sound of hammering from somewhere outside the house. He'd been sleeping poorly since losing his companion, often finding himself listening for the familiar click of claws on hardwood floors that would never come again. The rhythmic pounding drew him to the kitchen window, where he discovered Tom Bradley and Frank Morrison installing a new ramp leading to the workshop entrance. "Morning, David," Tom called out when he spotted him. "Hope we didn't wake you. Wanted to get this done before the weather turns." David stepped outside, still wearing yesterday's clothes. The past weeks had been a blur of grief and determination as he threw himself into learning his father's craft. His hands were permanently stained with wood stain and linseed oil. His body ached from unfamiliar motions, but the work provided the kind of healing that no therapist had ever offered. "You didn't have to do this," David said, gesturing at the ramp. Frank looked up from his position where he was securing a support beam. "Your dad would have wanted the workshop accessible to everyone. We've been talking to some folks. There's interest in woodworking classes, maybe a program for veterans dealing with readjustment issues. Thought you might want to consider it." The suggestion caught David off guard. He'd been so focused on completing his father's unfinished projects that he hadn't considered the broader possibilities. The workshop had become his sanctuary, the place where he could feel Robert's presence most clearly. The idea of sharing it felt both terrifying and oddly right. "I'm not qualified to teach anyone," David protested. "I'm barely figuring this out myself." Tom climbed down from the ramp and wiped his hands on a rag. "Sometimes the best teachers are the ones still learning. You've got something most instructors don't. You understand what it means to need healing. That workshop saved you, same way it saved your father. Maybe it could save others too." That afternoon, David found himself walking through downtown Bar Harbor, really seeing the community for the first time since his return. He passed the hardware store where Tom worked, the small medical clinic where Dr. Chen practiced, the church where his mother's memorial service had been held 32 years ago. Each building held memories, connections to a life he'd abandoned in his rush to escape. At the post office, he ran into Sarah Martinez, a woman about his age who'd graduated high school 2 years behind him. She was struggling with a large package while trying to manage 2 young children, a boy around 8 and a girl who couldn't have been more than 5. "David Mitchell?" Sarah's face lit up with recognition. "I heard you were back in town. I'm so sorry about your father." "He was always kind to my kids when they'd visit the hardware store." David helped her with the package, noting the military shipping label. "Your husband deployed?" Sarah's expression tightened slightly. "Was Kevin came back from his 3rd tour last year with some challenges? He's at the VA facility in Togus now, getting help with PTSD and traumatic brain injury. The kids and I are managing, but it's—" She trailed off, clearly not wanting to burden a relative stranger with family problems. "It's hard," David finished for her. "I know something about that." The boy, who'd been eyeing David with the careful assessment children reserve for new adults in their mother's orbit, spoke up. "Are you a soldier too?" "I was, for 15 years. "Did you know my dad? He was in Afghanistan." David knelt to the boy's level. "I was there too, but it's a big place. What's your name?" "Tommy. This is my sister Emma. Mom says Dad is sick in his brain from the war, but he's getting better." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "Some days are harder than others. Kevin has good days and bad days. The doctors say it takes time. That evening, David found himself in the workshop reading more of his father's journal entries. He'd discovered that Robert had written extensively about the therapeutic nature of woodworking, how the focus required for detailed craftsmanship helped quiet the chaos of grief and anxiety. November 12, 2019. Made a cutting board for Mrs. Patterson today. Her arthritis makes cooking difficult, but she insists on maintaining her independence. The board has raised edges and a well for catching juice, functional beauty that serves a purpose. There's something sacred about making objects that ease other people's struggles. I think this is what Martha meant when she said, "Love should be practical, not just emotional." A soft knock at the workshop door interrupted David's reading. He looked up to find Malcolm Torres standing at the entrance, but this wasn't the aggressive developer who'd pressured him weeks earlier. This Malcolm looked older, tired, his expensive suit wrinkled and his usual confidence replaced by something approaching humility. "I know you probably don't want to see me," Malcolm began, "but I owe you an explanation, maybe an apology." David set down the journal, his military training keeping him alert, but not immediately hostile. "I'm listening." Malcolm stepped into the workshop, his eyes taking in the carefully organized tools and the partially completed crib. "My father was a veteran, too. Korea. He came back and tried to make a life as a carpenter, but the nightmares, the drinking. He lost everything. Our house, his business, his marriage to my mother. He died in a VA hospital when I was 16, alone and broken." David waited, sensing there was more to come. "When I heard you were back, struggling with your own readjustment, I convinced myself I was protecting you from my father's fate. The development project would have given you financial security, freedom from the burden of maintaining this place." Malcolm's voice cracked slightly. "But I was really just trying to rewrite history to save my father by saving you, whether you wanted saving or not." "The building code violations?" David asked. "Real, but minor. Nothing that couldn't be fixed with basic maintenance and some updating. I exaggerated the problems, used my connections to create pressure." Malcolm looked ashamed. "I told myself it was for your own good, but honestly, I was also thinking about the commission, about the profit potential. I'm not proud of that." David studied Malcolm's face, looking for signs of deception but finding only genuine regret. "What changed your mind?" "I drove by here yesterday and saw you working on that ramp with Tom and Frank. Saw the way the community was rallying around you, supporting you instead of trying to save you from yourself. It reminded me of something my father used to say before the war broke him. A man needs roots and purpose, not just money." Malcolm reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder. "These are all the permits and development plans for the coastal project. I'm withdrawing the application. This land should stay in your family, should serve the community the way your father intended." David accepted the folder, surprised by the gesture. "What will you do now?" "I don't know. Start over, I guess. Maybe find a way to honor my father's memory that doesn't involve bulldozing other people's legacies." Malcolm headed toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, your father would be proud of what you're doing here. The whole town is talking about it, the workshop, the classes you're planning, the way you're carrying on his tradition." After Malcolm left, David sat alone in the workshop, processing the unexpected reconciliation. The developer's transformation reminded him of something Dr. Chen had said about grief and healing, that sometimes the most broken people became the most committed to preventing others from experiencing the same pain. The next morning brought a surprise visitor. Sarah Martinez stood at the front door with her 2 children, all 3 of them carrying small bags. "I hope this isn't presumptuous," Sarah began, "but Tommy hasn't stopped talking about meeting you. He's been asking if he could learn to make something with his hands, something to send to his father. I thought maybe—" "You want him to try woodworking?" Tommy stepped forward with the earnest intensity only 8-year-olds could muster. I want to make Dad a box for his medals. He keeps them in a drawer, but they deserve something special." David looked at the boy's hopeful face and felt something shift in his chest. Not the sharp pain of loss he'd been carrying, but a gentler ache that felt oddly like healing. "Have you ever used tools before?" "Only toy ones, but I'm careful and I listen good." Emma, not to be outdone by her brother, piped up, "I want to make something too, for Mommy." David found himself smiling, the first genuine smile since Ranger's death. "Well then, I guess we'd better get started." Over the following weeks, the workshop transformed from a solitary sanctuary into something Robert Mitchell had never imagined but would have absolutely loved. A gathering place where healing happened through the simple act of creation. Tommy proved to have steady hands and infinite patience, working slowly but determinedly on a metal display box made from maple. Emma, despite her age, showed remarkable focus when carving simple shapes from soft pine. Other families began to hear about the informal classes. Frank Morrison brought his grandson, who was struggling with anxiety after his parents' divorce. Dr. Chen mentioned the program to some of her patients dealing with depression and chronic pain. Word spread through the small community like ripples in a pond. David discovered that teaching woodworking was vastly different from military instruction. Here, mistakes weren't failures. They were opportunities to learn about the forgiving nature of wood, about how something that seemed ruined could be repaired, refinished, transformed into something even more beautiful. The unfinished crib became a centerpiece of the workshop, not as Robert's abandoned project, but as a symbol of ongoing creation. David worked on it during quiet moments, following his father's careful drawings while adding his own touches, small modifications that honored the original design while reflecting his own understanding of love and craftsmanship. Tom Bradley helped David establish the workshop as a non-profit organization, with a board of directors that included Dr. Chen, Frank Morrison, and surprisingly, Malcolm Torres, who had asked to contribute both funding and administrative expertise as a form of redemption. "Your father always said the best gifts were the ones that kept giving long after the giver was gone," Tom observed one evening, as they watched a group of veterans sand their projects with meditative focus. "I think he'd be amazed to see what grew from the seeds he planted." On a crisp October evening, 6 weeks after Ranger's death, and 2 months after his return to Bar Harbor, David sat in the workshop reading the final entries in his father's journal. The last entry was dated the day before Robert's death. March 15, 2024. "I may not live to see David come home, but I'm no longer afraid of that possibility. Love doesn't require presence. It only requires planting. I've planted everything I can in this workshop, in this house, in the community that raised my boy. Someday, when he's ready, he'll find what I left for him. Not just the tools and the projects, but the understanding that love is a verb, not just a feeling. It's something you do with your hands, your time, your life. I may not be there to see him learn this lesson, but I trust that he will. He's his mother's son as much as mine. He has the capacity for great love. He just needs to discover his own language for expressing it." David closed the journal and looked around the workshop, now filled with the works in progress of a dozen different hands. Tommy's metal box sat nearly complete on one workbench. Emma's wooden flower occupied a place of honor on another. Projects by veterans, children, grieving spouses, and curious neighbors filled every available surface. The workshop had become exactly what Robert Mitchell had intended, a place where love was expressed through action, where healing happened through the patient transformation of raw materials into objects of beauty and function. It wasn't just David's inheritance anymore. It was the community's gift to itself, a living memorial to the understanding that sometimes the most profound conversations happen without words. Outside, the early October wind carried the scent of salt and changing seasons. Winter would come to coastal Maine, as it always did, but this year David would be ready for it. He had purpose now, community, and most importantly, he had finally learned to speak his father's native language, the eloquent grammar of love expressed through careful hands and patient hearts. David's story reminds us that sometimes our greatest treasures hide in plain sight, waiting for us to develop eyes to see them. Like Robert Mitchell's silent love expressed through sawdust and careful joinery, the deepest connections in our lives often speak in languages we haven't learned to understand. How many of us have dismissed a parent's practical concerns as lack of affection or mistaken quiet devotion for indifference? David's father spent 42 years waiting for his son to come home, not just physically, but emotionally ready to receive love in the form it was offered. The workshop became a bridge between generations, transforming individual grief into community healing. Perhaps that's the most profound lesson. Love multiplies when we stop hoarding it and start sharing it. David's woodworking classes for veterans and children didn't diminish his father's legacy. They fulfilled it in ways Robert never imagined possible. The unfinished crib became a symbol not of incomplete dreams, but of ongoing hope, reminding us that some of life's most meaningful projects are the ones we pass along for others to complete. In our autumn years, we each carry hidden workshops filled with accumulated wisdom, unspoken love, and dreams waiting to be shared with those who need healing. What hidden language of love might you have missed from someone important in your life? Share a story about a time when you discovered someone cared for you in ways you hadn't initially recognized. We'd love to hear how understanding changed your relationship with that person.